Today, I'm going to talk about the Universalist part of Unitarian Universalism. Now, you've probably heard this before. Whereas Unitarians, especially in early 19th century America, believed that men, like themselves, were too good to be damned by God, Universalists believed that God was too good to damn them. In other words, that all could be saved. This message of universal salvation, that all can be saved, this message of universal love, has been preached in some form or another in America from the time of John Murray, the founder of the first American Universalist Church, to the present day. The message has been transformed quite significantly through the generations. It was a Christ-centered message of salvation, and now, in its present form, it's what we know as a more humanist message of liberation. However, as altered as it may seem, its foundation remains quite consistent. Universal salvation, or in the vernacular of today, liberation, is available for all humans. It seems as simple as that, and on one level it is. But what's often missed is that at its core, it's also about sacrifice. Now that sacrifice, associated with the sacrifice of Christ at the beginning, is embodied today in the sacrifice of each of us, the sacrifice that each of us makes for the liberation of the other. Further, our Universalist faith is deeper in another way than just about our ability to be free, to be saved. It's also always been about action. You see, only with compassion, empathy, and action to help our fellow human can we all be saved, can we all be liberated. Whether that action was finding faith in Christ or is social justice. In fact, taking action in social justice has indeed always been present as well in our Universalist faith. This morning, I'd like to demonstrate this by connecting 18th century liberal religion in America to this moment in order to better understand how the idea of universal salvation manifests and ties into social justice. I'll draw the line through over 200 years of Universalism by featuring historical documents. And hopefully, this concrete representation will help us visualize the enduring themes of the Universalist aspect of our faith and better guide us in how we should be living our values. I'll begin with a quote from a letter penned by Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and an early convert to Universalism. He wrote this letter to Dr. Richard Price, who was a prominent Unitarian. He wrote, "These principles, Universalist principles, my dear friend, have bound me to the whole human race. These are the principles which animate me in all my labors for the interests of my fellow creatures. No particle of benevolence, no wish for the liberty of a slave or the reformation of a criminal will be lost. They must all be finally made effectual, for they all flow from the great author of goodness, who implants no principles of action in man in vain." Now, the true importance of this letter is the fact that it connects quite clearly Universalist theology with the need to address the social issues of the day, action on social justice. And although Dr. Rush's principles certainly lied in his Christological beliefs, and modern Universalist principles of salvation are founded in liberation theology, the directive he insists upon then is the same as we do now. As he writes in the letter about slavery and prison reform, which were the issues of his day, he quite clearly asserts that one cannot follow a faith that preaches universal salvation without addressing social justice concerns. Benevolence or kindness toward others is essential to a faith of universal salvation. We've isolated a commitment to social justice and deference to all human life, even in the earliest expressions of Universalist thought. One of the most prominent 20th century Universalist reformers was Clarence Skinner, a professor, university dean, and a minister. His goal was the irrevocable connection between religion and the social issues surrounding it. Not just taking action on social justice, but making that connection an irrevocable, unbreakable connection between social justice and religion. In his 1915 statement, The Social Implications of Universalism, he states, "All great social problems involve theological conceptions. We may divorce church from state, but we cannot separate the idea of God from the political life of the people. So intimate is the connection between religious and social development, he writes, that the history of tribal and national evolution reveals the fact that a particular type of theology is an almost inevitable concomitant of a particular type of society. There is a constant interaction between ideals of economic and political life on the one hand, and ideals of God on the other hand. As man attains increasing democracy, he conceives God as being more universal, more just, and more intimately associated with life. And as God is conceived to be more universal, just, and intimate, the idea begets more democracy among men. Social action and theological reaction are equal and in the same direction. Now, but what does Clarence Skinner mean by God? Is it similar to how present-day UUs refer to a divine spirit, a spirit of life? Well, he concludes with this. He writes, the universalist idea of God is that of a universal, impartial, immanent spirit whose nature is love. That sounds like today. It's the largest thought the world has ever known, he writes. It is the most revolutionary doctrine ever proclaimed, he continues. It is the most expansive hope ever dreamed. This is the God of the modern man and the God who is in modern man. This is no tribal deity, he continues, of ancient divisive civilization. This is no God of the nation of a chosen people, but the democratic creator of the solid, indivisible world of rich and poor, black and white, good and bad, strong and weak, Jew and Gentile, bond and free. End quote. Now that sounds very modern and humanist, doesn't it? This definition of God. So now this was followed soon after, Clarence Skinner, what he wrote was followed soon after by a social program at the Universalist General Convention in 1917. This social program wanted guarantees of equal housing, education, food, and recreation. It called for economic equity and condemned economic monopoly and exploitation and war. It called for a mobilization of forces, not just the results of injustice, but the causes as well, which create misery, disease, accidents, ignorance, crime. Its program was meant to complete humanity. And this included equitable economic order, included social order, included moral order, and it included spiritual order. Now, doesn't this also sound like what we are working toward today? To simplify the themes in these documents, I would say our universalist legacy does not just claim that all can be saved, that all can be free. It's more important that since all can be free, our faith demands that all must be free, and further, it calls each of us to realize that with action. If these themes sound familiar to those who attended the past General Assemblies, they should. The line does not deviate, even up to 2020. We are driven by the same values, undeterred. There are significant differences as well, however, today. First, I believe our awareness has broadened in a number of significant ways, or at least is in the process of broadening. First of all, as much as we have been more focused on society around us throughout our history, our focus today has now also turned much more inward. And we're gaining cognition that not only are we not the final arbiters of appropriate social justice, as we often thought we were, but we ourselves are guilty of inappropriate conduct toward our fellow humans, especially those of us with privilege. We are realizing that true equity cannot be achieved without an honest accounting of our own sins. Secondly, the definition of humanity, which has been co-opted for too long by the white perspective, is at long last expanding to all people, the privileged as well as the marginalized, the disaffected, and the erased. We are today especially conscious of our racist past and present. We can and we must look back on our predecessors, the same people who wrote the words I've quoted herein, and recognize that, even though, yes, they were abolitionists, they were pacifists, they were social reformers, they believed in equality, they also, too, were influenced, as we are, by our imperial white supremacist culture. Their relationship to people of color, including black, brown, indigenous, and other marginalized populations, was fraught with dysfunction and prejudice as it remains today for white people and people of privilege. Now, it is this new awareness, however, and hopefully a willingness to be accountable, that gives me hope in actual progress towards a truly equitable society. For too long, we ignored the fact that our faith rests on a culture whose economic structures depend on the annihilation of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans forcibly relocated and enslaved. We can ignore this no longer. For too long, we have hyper-focused on the individual, free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which is one of our principles. Moving forward, rather than the individual, we must make this search a communal search. Now, one of our most prominent theologians, James Luther Adams, stated this actually quite succinctly when he said, "The faith of free persons must tangibly make them free in a community of human dignity and equal justice." But it's not just white male theologians to whom we must listen. The final document I want to reference, one that completes the line from then to now and demonstrates our newfound awareness, it's called Widening the Circle of Concern, and it is the report from the Commission on Institutional Change that was presented at the General Assembly just this year. After a racially charged incident in 2017, our leaders of color were asked by the co-presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt and Reverend William Sinkford and Dr. Leon Spencer, to share insights into how the Unitarian Universalist Association could continue moving forward. This was, as the report puts it, a request for truth and reconciliation. An accounting, if you will. So a commission was formed, which included Reverend Leslie Takahashi, Mary Byron, Sir Lebert Jr., Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore, Dr. Elias Ortega, and was project managed by Reverend Marcus Fogliano. They took these insights and over 3 years analyzed them, audited the power structures, the systematic racism, and the white supremacy culture within the UUA, and reported back. And along with another accounting of how our association has or has not grown and changed over the 3 years they worked. They included this further accounting in the report. They laid out recommendations for supporting long-term cultural and institutional change that, quote, redeems the essential promise and ideals of Unitarian Universalism. They understood very well that our theological underpinnings, which connect us to our predecessors, demand that we do this work. Now, the very point of the work, to be accountable, to openly talk about our own culpability, is also necessarily to center voices within our faith that have gone unheard for too long. It's essential. We've begun to do this in numerous ways, including with the diverse representation I mentioned on the Commission for Institutional Change. And their report gives us concrete ways to continue to center voices marginalized for too long. One of our youth leaders, Paloma Cayo, is quoted in the report from a homily she delivered in 2016. She writes and speaks, "Only when we come to bear witness to the cracked and shattered pieces can we begin to help heal what has been broken." Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt relates this to our universalist theology in this way. Only a universalist theology of liberation in the present day centers our capacity to be sanctuaries of radical truth-telling and abundant compassion, so that the all-embracing love, that love I talked about, at the center of our tradition, can serve to make all of us more whole. This is the same universal love that Dr. Benjamin Rush described in 1790 as God, and we continue to strive for today as Universalists. Now, this work is just beginning, but it starts with this awareness, widening the circle of concern. This Commission's report lays out a great blueprint to begin constructing a UUism that is free from prejudice of all kinds. This is what gives me hope that our faith will survive and thrive in a society that will not improve without complete accountability, a society that not only demands social justice, but reparative and restorative justice. Now, I'll not go into all they found in this report and all they recommended. Please read it. I will, however, share some excerpts that show the theological mandate of universalism that has been unbroken over time. Under the section Principles to Guide Work, One of the bullet points states this: we need our practice of Unitarian Universalism and our fellow Unitarian Universalists to call us into living the fullness of the theology we inherit and claim. And I would argue that this is principally our Universalist mandate, to liberate all. Under the section, A Word About Centering, it connects this work, calling us in, to the compassion and sacrifice I mentioned earlier, that is the overlooked yet key element to universal liberation. It writes, honoring the experience and discernment will require that we cultivate compassion, and it will help to look at the etymology of that word, compassion. Com, meaning with or together, and passion, derived from pati, which means endure, undergo, experience. So can we feel what another experiences? It continues later in the same section this way. By centering, we mean a leaning toward, a prioritizing of perspective, attention to whose needs are considered and who is most affected. And this is not done easily. It's not done without what I mentioned earlier: sacrifice and pain. Necessary sacrifice and pain that others who have sacrificed and hurt for too long are freed from their burdens. Only then can we all be liberators from our burdens as well. Dr. Elias Ortega, member of the commission and the current president of Meadville Lombard, one of our two remaining UU theological schools, he talks as well about sacrifice in this report. He writes, if we believe in collective salvation, universalism, we must also believe in collective sacrifice. It is powerful that our faith community is working to reclaim this sacred practice, and claiming what is meant to be sacred in personal sacrifice without the power of we, community, is the very thing that desecrated the practice. Ernest Cassara, who edited the book Universalism in America, A Documentary History of Liberal Faith, writes in his introduction to Chapter 6, which is called The Conscience of Universalism, he writes that it should be expected that a gospel which preached the ultimate salvation of every individual in the future life would be concerned with the lot of man on earth. And social reform has indeed been a through line through American Universalist history in the 19th century with Rush, Horace Greeley, Clara Barton, and others, into the 20th century and on into today. I'll conclude with the words of Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt. We are the theological inheritors of teachings on universal salvation, she writes. It is our very universalism that is at stake when we turn away from the impact that our institutions have on the same communities and groups that society encourages us to dehumanize and make small. So, freedom for all through sacrifices is how we must live. That is what our Universalist faith calls us to. And to do it justice, we now also understand, thankfully, that that must include accountability. This is our Universalist legacy.